Thank you, Colleen and Deborah, for those kind words. Let me just share my screen so you don't have to stare at my face. It's a real pleasure to talk to this group. I'll try to keep it to 20 minutes, and I'll try to reach out of my comfort zone a bit as well. The topic, as you know, is one that is very apropos. And one thing I'd want to make sure is that everyone has had a chance to see the video that you asked folks to watch. And if not, this is what it is. It's a video by Geoffrey Bennett. He's an astrophysicist, but he's also a children's story writer. And he has what I think is probably one of the best summaries of the climate crisis. And in fact, it's so good that, I would recommend turning off this Zoom and going to watch it if you haven't watched it. It's very, very powerful. And what I'm going to be talking about really is an extension of the thoughts and the data that he presented. But again, I really, really recommend that you go and take a look at this. My original title when Colleen and Deborah asked me to speak to you was Rethinking the Ethos of Academic Research in an Age of Changing Climate. And that's because, as you'll see, the way we do research needs to really change if we're going to address the climate crisis. But of course, as we all know, and here we are living it ourselves, the crisis with COVID-19 is really the beta version of a climate change. It came fast, it came hard, and everybody's reacting accordingly. It's really nothing compared to what's down the pike if we don't solve effectively the problem we created. And this is why you need to go see Geoffrey Bennett's presentation. One of the things that he brings up in this presentation is the importance for assuming responsibility. And the concept is one that I'm going to come back to, and that's agency breeds agency. And it's a bit strange for me to be talking to you here today because you mentioned that, for example, that UCSD has a huge history in climate, and it does. I mean, the original observations are from here. The UC itself as an institution has a lot of activities. And here I am. I'm not a climatologist. I'm not an astrophysicist. I'm not even a doctor. I'm not a nurse. I'm not an engineer, not a computer scientist. I'm just some lab rat hack who does molecular and cell biology. And here I am talking to you guys about climate. It really makes no sense, and maybe that's another reason you should really go see this video by Bennett. But I'm going to talk about three things today, and one is how it ties to what we could call the academic threat of these multipliers, and that's how we do research today. I mentioned the issue of agency breeding agency and how it's important that what we call the power of you. We all need to, as individuals, be taking action. And then finally, and it ties to this notion of agency, this infection model of knowledge. And there's a concept of climate justice, for example, and we see this now with COVID. The different populations are being hit differently by this. And in fact, there's a larger impact tied with disparities in particular, as well as with women. Let me first, before I get into it, let me convince you that in fact I am way out of my water. I mean, and I really want to get into my comfort zone here. I'm actually interested in the biology of vasculature, as you can see here on the left. It's a significant. We'd like to think of it as an organ in the body, and the reason that it's important is it brings blood to all every single cell that we have. And with that, you can increase wound healing, or you can have tumors to grow in both the good and the bad of blood vessel growth, angiogenesis. And our claim to fame, if any, is that we were involved in the isolation characterization of this molecule shown here on the right, which was fibroblast growth factor, which is the first angiogenic factor to be identified, followed soon after by a molecule called VEGF, discovered by Napoleon Ferrara, who's now at the Moores Cancer Center. We became interested in this molecule and began to ask the question of, why are we so different from other species? And when I first came to UCSD, one of the things I asked of my colleagues was, what is it that you find as being the most critical question in surgery? And this was in critical care. This is speaking with Raul Coimbra, who at the time was head of the division. And he was pretty clear. He basically said, the problem we have is that we have two patients who have basically the identical background as far as we know, same age, same gender, same experience, and one survives and one doesn't. And this, the trauma and the experience in critical care. And this resonates, especially today, when you think of what we're hearing happening with the patients responding to COVID. You can have two identical patients, one responds well and one doesn't respond at all, and of course have different outcomes. And this is an example of one of these issues. And this is a paper in PNAS, which appeared using a database where they looked at gene expression. It doesn't matter where, and they basically showed, using analyzing this data, that there was actually a poor response between the human response and the mouse response. And I'm only showing you this because of this, and that's someone else analyzing this same data set and basically coming to the exact opposite conclusion, and that in fact finding that the mouse response mimics the human inflammatory response. The point I'm trying to make is, be careful with your data, because how you analyze it is going to critically change the kinds of results you get. And this is important because as we look at the effects of climate, if we're looking at them, and for example, in this group at the top, these three young women, there's a good chance that because of their similarities, in fact, they'll respond quite in a similar fashion. These compounded, of course, by the reality of what we have in the human paradigm, and that's in the effects of age, of gender, and as I mentioned earlier, disparities. One of the main predictors of outcome, and we've certainly seen this in the experience that's being reported with COVID, is that age is the main predictor of outcome. And the fact of the matter is, chronological aging is something that certainly can't be delayed, but puts us in a situation of susceptibility. However, there's a different kind of aging that I'd like to talk about as well, and that's epigenetic aging. And that's the aging that takes place simply as a function of lifestyle. So again, you can have two gentlemen like the folks here in this middle picture, and in fact, their age will be the same, but their epigenetic status will be very different, leading to a differential response. And this is one of the things that we're particularly interested in. What is it that makes identical individuals both different from each other, different from their cohort, but as well the response different from animals? And this is simply to show you at least one piece of data where Colleen mentioned that we're interested in the uniquely human response to inflammation. This is one example where we took one gene that's only found in humans. It has no cognate in mice at all. It's not even part of the response when we look at in mice. If you introduce it into mice, as you can see down here, you change the profile of hematopoietic stem cells in their bone marrow. So now I'm in a pretty comfortable zone in terms of where I stand with the science, but you got to think to yourself, who cares? I mean, as a molecular and cell biologist, and you look and you say, well, gee, compared to the planetary climate crisis, you know, boy, what does this mean, and how could we contribute to this global problem? And this is really where we were a year, maybe 18 months ago. And that's primarily because the climate crisis is going to impact will impact every aspect of our life, indeed, exactly as this pandemic has. It has economic consequences, health consequences, of course. We're seeing consequences on security. And as I mentioned earlier, we're seeing all these effects on disparity, where not all humans not all of humans are being targeted in a similar way. So what does this mean for us as academics and educators and as scientists and mentors and mentees in terms of how do we respond to this? And so one of the things Colleen and Deborah wanted me to do was to talk to you a bit about my own experience in this and how it is possible, even though you're coming from a completely unrelated background, it is possible to take agency and hopefully participate in this infectious model of we need to be doing something about this. So this is an example of what are we going to do? So let's just admit that, let's just accept that you've seen the video, you've recognized that this is an issue that we can resolve. What can we in academia be doing about this? Well, we can simply keep it business as usual, and we've seen what's happening in the COVID crisis. And that's basically that's basically to continue doing research the way we do it in academia. And that's, we're basically act as independent contractors. We're basically responsible for funding our labs, supporting our research, supporting our students, supporting our postdocs, and keeping it going. In fact, the ethos is really one of the individual. What we posit is that, in fact, we really have to develop a new way of looking at research if we're going to be able to address these kinds of global challenges. And so we need to change how we think, we need to change how we act. That's basically agency, taking personal responsibility and personal action. The second is we need to be able to change how we interact. And most importantly, as you'll see in a few minutes, I hope, we need to be changing the way we compete. And that's going to be probably the most difficult because, we are, as everyone, are pretty competitive. So let me give you an example of my personal voyage, if you will, recognizing after hearing, in fact, it was the bending curve UC group you see that really made me realize the scope of the issue that we need to be addressing. I really have changed how I educate and how I reach out to my fellows and students. I tell them whenever I can of the importance of their being on the forefront of addressing this issue. I've talked about it in my scientific societies. I've talked about it in study section and grant review panels. When someone in a grant review panel says, oh, well, this investigator isn't independent. Is independence really what we want? The day and age of the independent scientist working in the corner of his laboratory who's going to succeed is really gone. We really need to be working in collaboration. I've gained agency by working on different UCSD committees, including some university system-wide committees. A bit was what was mentioned. At the professional level, you might wonder, well, how do you change what you're doing when you're doing something so unrelated to climate? Well, in fact, what we've done is we've taken, if you looked at if you read between the lines what I was saying earlier, we took our work in angiogenesis and the control of cell growth, and we're now looking at the mechanisms that control human resilience, so that when infections come, for example, with COVID, we understand why are some people more resilient than others, and the inverse is true. Why are some people more susceptible than others? And it has to do with things like gene expression, the epigenetics, and the different background that we have, a genetic and epigenetic background, i.e. lifestyle. And you can hear this as well as you listen to the press when they speak about aging being targeted by the patient with COVID-19, or they talk about the aging with certain preconditions like diabetes, hypertension, and things like that. That's all the epigenetic, if you will, lifestyle associated changes in physiology. So where do we go with this? Well, what I would like to do is push for the idea that, in fact, what we need to do is go from the independent contractor who supports your own research, you pay for your own salary, and you justify your own promotion, to a new kind of model, a model where we have an interdependent coworker that, again, would be getting research support, but in a different kind of research model, a model that actually promotes collaboration, that they would have some kind of salary stability so that investigators aren't continuously looking for different opportunities to do the work they want to do. They're actually doing it in a targeted way. And then finally, within the ethos of an organization, we have to have an organization which is willing to promote, both at all levels, its investigators based on something less than the personal credit that they get in the public domain. And this turns out to be something that is much more difficult than you might think. So let me ask you this question. Obviously, you can't answer back, but this is a question I bring up about. It's if anybody actually knows what this is. And normally when I'm giving this kind of a talk, I get a few answers, and this time obviously I won't. So let me just jump to it and say this picture on the left here is actually the parachute of the rover landing on Mars. This is the rover traveling on Mars, and here this is actually a picture of a rock that the rover has lasered 100 meters away. Okay, 40 million miles, and we've accomplished this. Now think about that. That is really an extraordinary feat. We took something the size of a Volkswagen, sent it 40 million miles, and we're having it shoot a laser to destroy a rock, which we can then analyze. Okay, so that's pretty impressive. Now look at this, and you say to yourself, what is that? And this is the only gross picture I'll show you. This is a wound that's about 1.5 years old. It's not healing. And here's another wound. It turned into a scar. So this is effectively a wound that doesn't heal, and this is a wound that overheals. And yet here we are. We can send something 40 million miles, and we can't repair that wound. What is it that we're doing wrong? Well, everybody's asked, well, it's because it's too complicated. After all, it's biology. But in fact, maybe it's just that it's too expensive. We don't have the political will. But there's also a third possibility, and that's the fact that our approach is in fact wrong. Because if you look at how we actually got to Mars, I would submit that what we did is we managed to do that as a huge national collaboration by making it a national priority. It also turns out, by the way, that if you do want to repair the unhealing wound, you can actually get that done through comprehensive wound care. And that's something I won't go into it, but that we can certainly discuss. So let me give you a final example of this and say, well, how do other disciplines operate? And this is an example of the Higgs boson demonstration of the existence of the Higgs boson. And you'd say, well, okay, well, that's pretty interesting. And I think it is an important advance in physics. But physicists behave definitely differently than we do in health sciences. And I can't say anything about design. You'll have to decide for yourself. But here are two papers. And normally what I would ask is, guess how many authors there are. But I'll tell you right away, it turns out that each of these papers has 2,500 co-authors, okay? So the lesson in that is that if you're going to work on these collaborations in health sciences, you had better have a name that begins AAD blah, 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 if you want to be first author, or alternatively, you need a name that's going to end with a Z if you're going to be the last author and get the credit. The fact is that most of these people are going to be inside this mix. And this is the point. You rarely, if ever, see these kinds of collaborations, certainly in the health sciences. So if we're going to make the kind of headway we need to make in addressing the climate crisis, we as academics need to be behaving that way. What this means is that we need to have a new way of incentivizing our scientists so that they can think in a new way, and think fast, so that because especially fast when the changes around us might be slow. And this is the problem with climate. We saw the mobilization that's taken place in the response to COVID, but that's a mobilization that took place because overnight, and goodness knows, I don't have to convince this group, we saw our entire society change. We saw economic we saw economic changes, we saw societal changes, and here we are where last autumn, no one would listen to our task force calling for increased telemedicine and telecommunications. Now, of course, we're all doing it. So we need to have incentivizing ways in which we act, incentivizing how we interact, and incentivizing us in a society so that we can all succeed. And this is, in fact, the climate crisis that we face and that we need to meet. So in as much as the climate crisis itself is one that is huge and one that we have to address, we can look at our response to the COVID-19 crisis to basically say, yes, we can address this if we have the willpower. So not a question of the economics, we absolutely have to. It's going to impact our health, it's going to impact security, and it's going to target the disparate populations. And this is being seen in this beta test, as I mentioned, with the COVID-19. So what in all this will we be able to learn? Well, the first thing we've learned from the COVID crisis, which applies directly to the climate crisis, is you need to believe what the science tells you. And in fact, one of those is the notion of prevention. And I think everyone is now seeing that certainly with the social distancing, it looks to be a process. Well, the jury might be still out, but it looks to be a process that is certainly working. It is a process that absolutely worked in terms of the two other crises that we've had, which is MERS and SARS. And it's more than just a coincidence, I think anyway, that the three last potential pandemics that we've had have been since the year 2000. That would be SARS-1, MERS, and now COVID. This is, I believe, strictly tied to what's happening in the climate. It's a sign of things to come. So the second is to recognize that prevention is a science. And this is the issue we face with climate, which is and why it's so important, again, to go see this video, the notion that if we are responsible for having increased the carbon, then we have the capacity to prevent that carbon from going up, and the science is there to make this happen. The third aspect of this is that there's no single discipline that has all the answers. The climatologists have been working on this for a long time, since it first got described in the late 70s, early 80s. It has been the focus of climate research. It's now time to mobilize our entire society, not just in academia. And in academia, it calls for mobilization of the humanities, the ethics folks, the sociologists, as well as the folks in health sciences like myself. Finally, the other important thing is that, and we're seeing this with the climate, is the fact that we need to be working together to prevent the problem and to address the problem as it arises. So it's on this note, let me just finish about one of the things that we've been done. I'm going to talk about a project that's been run by Linda Hill, Eli Spencer, and Nadia Wiebel, and this ties in with the group here. And this has been an effort to create a rapid response to issues that arise. And again, this is something that has happened in the last, I think, 14 days, to recognize that we need to pull together all kinds of people throughout the San Diego community to help respond to this crisis. In this instance, the example I'm going to give, it was to focus on the frontline clinician and the needs they have in making sure that they're ready for what's being called the surge. They set up a response system in which anyone who needs help, and you can go see it at this website, anyone who needs help because they're at the front line can submit a question. That question then goes into the system, and through crowdsourcing from a group who are either experts and innovators, the problem solvers, this group then looks at the problem and then tries to, then does in fact provide the question with a solution. All this is then put into responding to the questionnaire and also put online so it's available to everyone worldwide. This is what's shown in this cartoon. You have the clinician at the bedside who's dealing with the infection, needs help, and can be anything from the most trivial to I need to pull together a investigational package to test a new drug, to something like, tell me what kind of interactions there might be between drugs, things like that. That message goes into the system, it gets analyzed in the system, and then the solution is returned to the investigator. This is, I think, an example of getting folks who would normally not be talking to each other or working together to actually come together to solve a problem, because our problems and our solutions simply aren't being matched in the way we do our siloed work within the university, and I'd say within the American research enterprise, if you will. So again, I alluded to this at the beginning. The COVID-19 crisis is really just a beta test for the climate crisis. And if you take anything home from the last, hopefully not 20 minutes or so, it's in fact that it's important to act now, act often, and act in every aspect of your day. And that feeling that you had, hopefully have had over the course of our experience in the last 3 weeks of, my goodness, what can I be doing to help us with the COVID crisis and the agenda? That same feeling we need to be deploying to address the climate crisis, which is around the corner. With that, let me make a couple of special mentions. I mentioned Linda Hill and Nadir Weibel and Eli Arnoff Spencer. Let me also put a shout out to Todd Cossettini and his team in the surgical critical care. These are my clinical partners who are really, they're just amazing in what they're doing. And finally, Brian Eliseri, who's my partner on the research side. Thank you, and I'll take any questions.
All right, thank you so much, Andrew. All right, yeah, I know it's Pete, because everybody has their microphone turned off, so we'll probably start taking questions in a minute. So
at this point, I'm just used to a resounding explosion.
You get one from Colleen.
There is actually a possibility to applaud, I think, in silently.
Yeah, do you guys want to applaud?
Yeah, anyway, but let me just start with a question that one of the participants asked, and it is as follows. With the discussion of moving from working as an independent contractor to an interdependent coworker, what are methods that can help the transition from working for yourself to collaborating?
So there's two aspects to that question, the internal and the external. The internal one is first to recognize that getting something accomplished in a group is going to be so much more effective than accomplishing it alone, although you'll have to share the credit. And the notion really is it's better to have a smaller piece of a pie than no pie at all, so kind of thing. So that's the internal one, is really, it's got to come from yourself, because at the end of the day, there is a certain thrill in the credit side of things. The second aspect of it, which I think is probably the most difficult, is the extrinsic factors. And that's the fact that we in our organization, in the ethos of our organization, tend to want to look at who was the first author on that paper, who is the last author on that paper, who is the PI of that grant, who is the co-PI of the grant, when in fact, it isn't the PI or the co-PI. In fact, it's the team that succeeded in delivering that, say, paper in Science, Nature, or whatever we're talking about. So how do you change that extrinsic ethos. Well, the only way we're going to change it is by having people, folks like who are in this room, well, not in this room, but in your own room, folks here, to actually go out and at their next meeting, when a candidate is being talked about in this way, to basically say, time out. How do we know this person isn't getting all the credit? And I think that we need to be presenting these issues at every opportunity we have, when we're talking to folks who are sitting on the Committee for Academic Promotions, for example, when we're sitting on a study section, when we're reviewing papers, that kind of thing. I don't know if that answered your question, but.
It answers that one and a couple of more that are coming up, but there's an interesting one here. Let me see. Let's see, they're coming. There was one that said, does the research that, so to help, does the research, does it have to be specifically about climate change, or can there be other ways in which you take climate change into account when you're doing research on X?
Absolutely. There's just no question, and I would submit that you can't be doing anything without actually doing it influenced by climate. So I was in the days when we used to fly, I was in a Southwest flight and always talking about this. I talked to the person next to me. She turns out to be a historian who teaches history at Irvine. And I said to her, what kind of agency can you use in history? And she says, well, in fact, what I do is I integrate the ideas of changes that have occurred over the last 1,000 years in human society and human migration, and I tie them to how those were driven by changes in climate. So it's really just a question of looking at what you've got and asking the question: is there a if I look at this through the prism of climate, am I looking at this any differently? And I think that you will.
Great. Tell me some questions that are coming through make me think that you use the word ethos in your title, and that how does that relate to culture, values? How do you see? Tell us what you mean by ethos.
That's exactly what I mean. I mean, it means the cumulative culture, the cumulative point of view, where you set your top priorities. This is basically on who you are as an individual, or in fact, who you are as an institution. So you look at the UC as an institution. We have built into our ethos over the last 10 years, 15 years, the fact that we really want to address the issue of women and minorities in our faculty. There aren't enough in our faculty. Well, this isn't something you can do overnight, right? But you can address it by increasing representation in our student population, increasing representation in our postdocs, trying to recruit in an environment which is difficult, let's say. So that's what the ethos is. The ethos is really the entire, to me, the entire ethical build that represents the values of who we are as individuals and institutions are.
Very nice. So I had a question. So I'm going to pose it in two kind of steps, because I think that some of the things that you are talking about now, maybe to undergraduates and even to graduate students, are not necessarily in their purview yet. How you apply for grants and how you have to spend your time fighting to get your lab going and stuff. But I also am curious about your transition. So the UC system is 10 colleges, right? 10 campuses. And you spent a lot of time at UCSD, and then you spent this time in a research committee where you had an opportunity to see you know, from the perspective of UC Regents, what's going on. So I'm curious if you can say some things about, do you see your message playing slightly differently from the UC level to UCSD level to undergrad, grad student? I hope that's not too complex, but.
It is whatever I decide I want to do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you know what I'm hearing is that let me just say that the message to everyone needs to be that in every aspect of what we're doing, we should be thinking about what does this mean to climate, period. And that applies across the board. As a graduate student, you know, if you're choosing your project, you know, maybe it's how can in design, for example, I can't think of a specific example, but like just anyone who's interested in systems, you know.
Yeah.
That's a pathetic answer to what I think was your question, but I guess I would say it resonates with everyone. The issue is, well, gee, it's too expensive. Okay, yeah, so is universal health care, but we just printed $1 trillion to, you know, so clearly it's not a question of money, it's a question of willpower. And where does willpower come from? Willpower comes from everybody in this room who basically say, no, I've had enough. And so that's what empowerment is. And it sounds hokey, but that empowerment doesn't have to be, you know, going to on a demonstration with a sign down the street. That empowerment can simply be making the day-to-day decisions that that will give you agency and personal authority, I guess, you know. There are some who say, well, it's, you know, it's not going to matter if you turn that light on or you turn that light off. And, you know, sure, it doesn't matter. But that's not the question. It's not a question of the light on or the light off. The question is really taking responsibility.
Right.
Yeah, that's really cool. Colleen, I suggest that maybe I think there's some raised hands.
Yeah. So go ahead and raise your hands. We're going to take raised hands in the from the from the participants list. And so when I call your name, go ahead and unmute yourself and show your video so Andrew can see you asking your question. It makes it a little bit more fun.
I much prefer it when Deborah screens the questions for me.
Yeah, that's way too easy. All right, so Jaya, I'm going to unmute you right now from the participants. So maybe we're going to see if this works. And I'm going to ask you to start your video. I think you had a raised hand, right? And I'm going to go through the grid.
Colleen, you could unmute and start their video for them. So
I thought I just did.
I don't see it here on my.
All right, make host. Just be patient for a second. I'm asking you to start your video and I'm unmuting you. Maybe there's so many people on, it's not exactly working. She will start video later. Maybe
I don't see it unmuted. That's interesting.
I don't either. Maybe you're declining. Okay, I see some claps, but no raised hands anymore.
There is a raised hand. Can I try maybe to do this? So here is Olfusio. I don't know how to pronounce your name.
Olfusio.
I can actually see the questions. Some questions here that are in the chat.
Okay, wait, okay. So can you show your video really quick? And I know that you had asked a little bit earlier.
Just clap.
Hello, hi.
And Jaya, we'll get to your question right after Sayo, if that's okay.
Yeah, my name is Fasayo. I really appreciated the talk. My question was I'm still a little confused about how your research has become more geared towards addressing the climate crisis, even if it's not directly, just like the steps you've taken to gear it in that direction.
Yeah, good question. So at a personal level, what we were interested in was the basic question of inflammation and injury, right? And so we're still doing inflammation and injury, but instead we're looking through it. Well, what's going to happen as climate changes? As climate changes, we need to be more resilient, right? We need to be more resistant to these environmental changes. So we can be doing almost the same work, but now all of a sudden we're looking at our results in a different kind of way. We're now looking at it and saying, gee, what is it about inflammation that makes one person more resilient than another? Because if we can understand what makes one person resilient, then maybe now we can understand why one person survives COVID and another person doesn't. Because they're getting the same inflammatory response. It's the same virus. It's often the same viral load. It's often the same aged patient. But the outcomes can be dramatically different. So we read the paper and we can see that there's a 35-year-old who didn't survive. And yet there are, maybe 100 other 35-year-olds that did survive. Mm-hmm. What is it about that one person? And if we can crack that nut, then all of a sudden we can increase resilience for everyone.
Okay. And
that's how we did it.
Okay. And do you think reframing that question encourages collaboration, or you think about collaboration before you reframe the question?
That's a really good question. I think that the two of them are tied, because as you start looking at what you're doing through a different lens, you start needing different kinds of expertise. And we're all smart. We can all learn to do things ourselves, but why not do it with somebody who's already doing it?
Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. And then you can do twice as much, twice as fast.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.
You bet.
All right, we're going to move to Jaya. So Jaya, why don't you go ahead and unmute yourself and start your video? Or I can maybe, I'm unmuting your audio. Oh, there you are. And you are muted. There you go. Okay, so you should be able to ask now. Go ahead.
I didn't have a question. I was just clapping my hands. I think you mistook that to raising my hand. Yeah.
You don't have any question at all. Okay, so let's move on. So as we're waiting for people to go ahead and raise their hands, because I hope the system is actually working.
I could ask another question that I'm curious about. So Andrew, what I'm hearing about COVID-19 in terms of the resilience of our community is that it's going to depend on robust testing. So I'm curious about your the task force that you showed us before that's happening around UCSD. If there's any traffic or anything that comes across your table that is about building testing, and maybe give us an understanding why having more testing has been such a challenge.
Yeah, I'm probably not the person to answer the second part of that question, which is why is testing a challenge. Frankly, I'm amazed that this is a disease that's 3 months old, right? To think that we now have tests where the results are out in 15 minutes is truly a testament to the power of human ingenuity when we get together to answer a question we can. In terms of the questions you had related to what are the hurdles to folks communicating, and how does the rapid response team work? Really, it's a question of getting using the crowdsourcing information that gets generated by discussion groups, moderating it, curating it to get the answers back to folks as quickly as possible. There's one question here that I see that I think is really great, and this is from Seth Shia, And she says, do you think that this kind of ethos shift is possible without a shift in our culture and our value system? And, my answer would be, I sure hope so, because it's what we're going to need to do if we are going to be able to respond to the climate crisis. And again, I would use as an example on the small scale, just comparing how we have come together as a society to respond to the COVID crisis in front of us. And we've had the advantage, of course, that what we've been able to develop a strategy by looking at what happened in China, what happened in Korea, what happened in Japan, what happened in Italy, what's happening in the EU, and now what's happening here. So we've had the benefit of being able to adapt over that period of time. But I think that it's only through this kind of activism and folks, assuming agency, that they're taking the ownership of this, that we will be able to make the changes to put us on the right course. We simply don't have a choice.
Yeah, so just as a follow-up to that, so it's interesting that with COVID, we do see that kind of response from just about everybody across the world, right? It's a crisis that's right there, right in your face, and you feel it, right? I suppose, and that's where a lot of this energy is coming from. And I'm wondering if that kind of energy can be tapped into when we're thinking about the climate, making changes for the climate. And if you have any
absolutely
thoughts about that.
And that's sort of the good news. And I use the example of our pushing for telecommunications. It's a great carbon neutral way of communicating. And our society is now changed forever. The societies that I'm with are looking at, having this kind of meeting where we can have this kind of dialogue and basically have a zero carbon footprint. This was unthinkable, not 2 years ago, not 1 year ago, not 3 months ago. This is all something that has arisen in, well, maybe it is 3 months, but it's really all come out over the course of the last year. If I can ask, unless there's a specific question, Molly Nicholas asked, how do you propose we change or update the reward structures in academia to support these changes? And yeah, you're right on the mark. That is a really, really important question. And this is part of the challenge we face, because we have to be really thinking about a new way of doing business. And we're going to be able, as we look at the COVID experience, this is why it's so good. Who's going to get credit for the advances that get in COVID? In fact, hopefully nobody will, because this is a societal challenge. And we need to take this, the fact that we will beat, and there's just no question, the fact that we will beat COVID is absolutely correct, just like we did it for SARS and MERS. The issue is, will we learn from this so that we can then use this same approach to defeat the things that we haven't defeated? Breast cancer. Why do we still have breast cancer? That we've made extraordinary progress with certain ones, but I would submit that maybe we should be looking at this system of having little labs all competing with themselves for little money. That in fact it gives incremental change. Maybe what we need to be doing is, instead of having scientists competing with each other to basically do the same experiment or similar experiments, maybe we should all be working together in a kind of in a new kind of way. But it is going to be extremely difficult. But we all have to dream.
Yeah, I think it's really. I'm just going to say one more thing, and that is, so in thinking about what you're saying about how this crisis kind of has already made some permanent changes, I think that it really behooves us to take advantage of some of the, to leverage some of the things that we've already seen change and make that a permanent change in our society. And I think one of the things that was really important to us, to Deborah and myself and Dawn, and in our conversations at the design lab when we were talking about whether we should even host a spring design at large, because usually we do it in person and it's a really nice kind of setting, and it's a really great experience. And do we even really want to try that, right? So we were thinking about canceling it. But I think that the message that we're trying to promote here with this series is that this is actually a perfect opportunity to really embrace some of the changes that we're talking about. And that is maybe reducing the carbon footprint by trying to make this a virtual meeting as well. And then design, right? So iterate our design. So this first meeting starts out, it's our first time in a Zoom meeting. We're trying out the chat window, we're trying out raising hands and things like that, but we can iterate and we can design and make it something that's much more rewarding, maybe near the end. So
there's one more question that I want to get to. It just came up from Russell Sadat, and he says, can you talk about the effect that open access will have on all of this? He also says, great presentation, so I thought I'd share that. This is something I do feel passionately about, because open access is the process by which we get the information. And I feel very strong on how important it is. I think it's absolutely unconscionable that research is behind a paywall. And UC has, much to its credit, supported by the academic senate, supported by faculty, has basically said, no, we need to be fighting for open access. And open access is really the process by which the things we do become part of public domain, as they should be, instead of paying through a page fee. And I think our artist colleagues are in shock that we actually pay to have our presentations actually presented. And I will point out that all of these paywalls, in the instance of COVID, have been taken down, so that now Joe Public, who's not part of the elite universities, who may not have access to the latest information, they can go to journals like JAMA, Lancet, NEJM, and they'll see these articles because they rightly made these papers all open access. If we truly believe that research that we do is research for society at large, it's got to be open to absolutely everyone. After all, we're doing it at the back, paid by the taxpayer. So yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's also an example of how UC faculty student activism has really made a significant impact and made a significant statement to the world in our to our libraries, negotiating with the academic publishing community. There has to be a different model to communicate research.